I'll give you $1 million. Grace Holloway looked up without saying a word. Across the private conference table, Alessandro Bellini never looked away. But you have to leave today. Every executive inside Bellini Global Capital froze. Nobody understood. Grace had become the only private chef in years capable of making the city's most feared Mafia Boss finish every meal placed before him. 7 celebrity chefs had failed. 2 Michelin star chefs had quit. Yet now the impossibly handsome billionaire wanted her gone. Grace slowly untied her apron and met his eyes. "Are you paying me because I'm not good enough?" She swallowed. "Or because you're afraid I'll leave first?" For the first time that morning, Alessandro Bellini had no answer. Nobody inside Bellini Manor expected Grace Holloway to survive her first week. The estate had become infamous among elite culinary circles. Celebrity chefs accepted the position only to resign days later. Some complained that Alessandro Bellini barely touched their masterpieces. Others admitted they could no longer tolerate cooking for a man who stared silently at every plate before walking away after 2 bites. Grace had heard every story. She accepted the job anyway, not because it paid extraordinarily well, not because serving one of the world's richest businessmen appealed to her. She simply believed every person deserved one meal that reminded them life could still be gentle. On her first morning, the kitchen staff waited nervously for instructions. They expected elaborate tasting menus, imported delicacies, and dramatic displays worthy of 5-star restaurants. Instead, Grace asked a single question. What did he love eating before he stopped enjoying food? The room fell silent. No one knew. Finally, the elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, hesitated before speaking. His mother used to make roasted chicken with rosemary, garlic mashed potatoes, and warm apple tart every Sunday. Grace smiled. Then that's where we'll begin. She never searched Alessandro's interviews. She never studied luxury dining trends. She never tried to impress him. She simply recreated the kind of meal someone longed for after spending years pretending they needed nothing. That evening, Alessandro entered the private dining room exactly on schedule. He barely acknowledged Grace before taking his seat. The servants exchanged worried glances. They had witnessed this ritual countless times. A polite bite, a silent nod, another untouched dinner carried back to the kitchen. Grace remained hidden behind the service door, refusing to watch. She believed food deserved patience, not pressure. Several minutes passed. No footsteps, no dishes returning. One waiter cautiously peeked inside. Alessandro was still eating, not tasting. Eating. The roasted chicken disappeared first, then the potatoes. Finally, the apple tart. He finished everything, even the last spoonful of vanilla cream. The entire kitchen stood speechless. When the empty plate returned, Grace merely laughed softly. I guess he was hungry. The staff looked at her as though she had performed a miracle. She shrugged. No. He was homesick. Word spread through Bellini Manor faster than any corporate announcement. The boss had finished dinner. The impossible had happened. Over the following weeks, Grace continued preparing meals that felt strangely ordinary. Fresh bread still warm from the oven. Tomato soup simmered slowly for hours. Braised beef that fell apart with a fork. Lemon cake served with afternoon tea, whether anyone requested dessert or not. Nothing looked extravagant. Everything tasted familiar. Without anyone realizing exactly when it happened, Alessandro stopped cancelling dinner. Board meetings were rescheduled around evening meals. Late-night conference calls ended earlier. Security guards noticed lights turning on in the dining room every night at precisely 7. Employees began joking that the mansion itself seemed less intimidating. Fresh herbs filled hallways once dominated by polished marble and silence. Laughter occasionally escaped the kitchen. Even long-time bodyguards accepted homemade cookies before overnight shifts. Grace greeted everyone by name. She remembered birthdays. She secretly packed leftovers for employees working overtime. Nobody had instructed her to do any of it. That was simply who she was. One evening, as Alessandro prepared to leave after dinner, he paused beside the kitchen entrance. Grace looked up from kneading bread dough. For several quiet seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, he nodded once. "The soup." His voice remained calm. It tasted exactly the way I remembered. Grace smiled, flour dusting one cheek. "I'm glad someone remembered with you." Alessandro stood there a moment longer before walking away. It was only a brief conversation. Yet every employee who witnessed it understood something extraordinary had begun. The most feared man in the city had not merely trusted someone to cook his meals. For the first time in years, he had trusted someone with a memory. Within 2 months, Bellini Manor had developed a routine nobody could remember existing before Grace Holloway arrived. Every morning at exactly 7:30, breakfast appeared in the sunlit conservatory overlooking the gardens. Every morning at exactly 7:45. It remained untouched. Grace sighed every single time. He skipped breakfast again. The kitchen staff exchanged amused glances. Nobody dared complain about Alessandro Bellini's habits. Nobody except Grace. She marched straight into his office, carrying a tray balanced effortlessly on one arm. Without knocking, she nudged the heavy door open with her shoulder. Alessandro looked up from a stack of financial reports. His expression remained perfectly composed. Grace, however, looked anything but intimidated. "You forgot breakfast." "I didn't forget. You ignored it." "I was working." She folded her arms. "Your body doesn't care whether you're negotiating billion-dollar mergers or organizing the spice cabinet. It still needs breakfast." Silence. Then Alessandro closed the file in front of him. "I'll eat later." Grace narrowed her eyes. "No." The single word startled even the security guards stationed outside. "You'll eat now." She set the tray on the coffee table. Scrambled eggs with fresh herbs, whole-grain toast, sliced oranges, fresh coffee, and a handwritten note tucked beneath the napkin. "No third cup until you finish the first plate." Grace smiled brightly before leaving. Only after the door clicked shut did Alessandro pick up the note. For reasons he couldn't explain. He smiled. 5 minutes later, the tray returned completely empty. The kitchen erupted into quiet celebration. "He ate all of it," one young pastry chef whispered, as though announcing state secrets. Grace merely nodded. "I knew he would." "You knew?" "He hates disappointing people." The staff blinked. They had worked for Alessandro for years. None of them had ever described him that way. Yet somehow, Grace saw things everyone else missed. Soon, similar moments became part of daily life. She replaced the endless espresso machine with a strict schedule. 3 cups, never 4. When Alessandro absent-mindedly reached for another mug one afternoon, his loyal assistant Lorenzo discreetly removed it before Grace entered. "The chef is watching," he murmured. Alessandro slowly withdrew his hand. Across the room, several executives pretended not to notice. Grace never realized the entire executive floor had begun following her rules simply because Alessandro did. She also insisted dinner ended before 9 o'clock. No laptops at the table. No business calls while chewing. And absolutely no reading financial reports between courses. The first evening she confiscated a leather folder from beside Alessandro's plate. Everyone expected disaster. Instead, he calmly handed it over. "As you wish." Forks froze in mid-air. One bodyguard nearly dropped his wine glass. Grace misunderstood their reactions. What? She looked around innocently. It was rude to work while eating. Nobody argued, because apparently the only person capable of telling Alessandro Bellini what was rude was the woman serving his soup. The playful routine spread beyond meals. If Alessandro looked tired, Grace quietly slipped homemade granola bars into his briefcase. If he returned from international travel, hot stew waited before he even removed his jacket. Whenever rainstorms delayed his flights, she kept bread dough rising because she knew fresh bread made long days feel shorter. She never asked where he traveled. He never explained. Their unspoken boundaries became another form of trust. Meanwhile, the mansion itself continued changing. Employees lingered in the kitchen after shifts just to hear Grace tell embarrassing stories about culinary school. Drivers competed over who received leftover cinnamon rolls. Even the intimidating security team softened whenever Grace insisted they taste experimental desserts. Laughter echoed through corridors once famous for silence. One evening, Noah Holloway visited his sister after work. Watching Alessandro accept a bowl of homemade tomato soup without a single complaint, he leaned toward Grace. "I've never seen a CEO obey someone like this." Grace laughed. "He doesn't obey me." "He absolutely does." She shook her head. "He's just polite." Across the dining room, Alessandro quietly reached for a fourth cup of coffee. Before he could take a sip, he noticed Grace glancing in his direction while arranging fresh flowers on the sideboard. Without saying a word, he slowly pushed the cup away. Noah stared. "You didn't even say anything." "I didn't have to." Grace smiled, completely missing the significance. "I think he's finally learning healthy habits." Alessandro caught the reflection of her smile in the dining room window. For the first time in years, discipline no longer felt like another burden. Somehow, it felt like someone had decided he was worth taking care of, and that frightened him far more than any enemy ever had. By early autumn, Grace Holloway had become something she had never imagined. Not a celebrity, not a famous chef, simply respected. Within Bellini Manor, respect meant more than compliments. It meant the gardeners saved the ripest tomatoes for her kitchen. The drivers volunteered to pick up specialty ingredients before dawn. The security team quietly defended her whenever visiting guests questioned why the world's wealthiest CEO employed someone who looked more like a neighborhood baker than a luxury chef. Grace noticed none of it. She was too busy planning dinners. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, however, her ordinary routine changed forever. Noah arrived carrying a cream-colored envelope, sealed with a gold emblem. "I think you should sit down," Grace laughed. "You only sound this dramatic when the restaurant health inspector visits." "I'm serious." She wiped flour from her hands before opening the envelope. The words blurred for a moment. The Grande Étoile International Hotel, one of the most prestigious luxury hotels in the world. They were launching a flagship culinary program. They wanted Grace Holloway as their new executive head chef, triple her current salary, complete creative control, an international media campaign introducing her as the face of modern luxury dining. Grace read the letter 3 times before whispering, "They've made a mistake." "They haven't," Noah replied. "They've been hearing about you for months." She stared at him. Hearing what? That a private chef nobody had ever heard of accomplished something 7 celebrity chefs couldn't. Grace lowered her eyes. "I only cook dinner." "No." He smiled gently. "You gave someone his appetite back." Those words stayed with her long after Noah left. That evening, Alessandro immediately sensed something was different. Grace still greeted everyone warmly, She still prepared dinner with her usual care, yet her smile carried the distracted weight of someone standing before a crossroads. Halfway through dinner, he noticed an elegant envelope resting beside her recipe notebook. He recognized the embossed crest instantly. The Grande Étoile. His knife paused. Lorenzo, seated several chairs away during the business discussion following dinner, noticed the almost invisible change in his employer's expression. Alessandro finished the meal. He listened to financial reports. He approved 2 international acquisitions. Yet one thought kept returning. Why would the Grande Étoile contact Grace? Later that night, he quietly asked Lorenzo, "What do you know about their new culinary division?" Lorenzo looked surprised. "They're recruiting internationally." "I know that. They're searching for a signature chef, someone authentic instead of another television celebrity." Silence. Then Lorenzo added carefully, "Grace fits that description." Alessandro gave no response. He simply dismissed everyone earlier than usual. The next morning, he entered the kitchen before sunrise. Grace nearly dropped a wooden spoon. "You're awake before breakfast?" "I couldn't sleep." She frowned. "That's not an answer." He almost smiled. "I'm trying." Without thinking, she poured him a cup of herbal tea instead of coffee. He accepted it without complaint. Only after he left did Grace realize how unusual the exchange had been. Meanwhile, whispers spread quietly throughout Bellini Manor. The hotel offered her the job. They'll triple her salary. She'd be crazy to refuse. Every employee celebrated for Grace. Every employee, except one. Alessandro found himself wandering through the mansion for reasons he refused to examine. The library felt quieter. The dining room seemed strangely temporary. He caught himself wondering who would bake fresh bread on rainy afternoons, who would argue about his coffee, who would remember Mrs. Brooks preferred extra cinnamon in her tea. None of those thoughts made sense. Grace was an employee, nothing more. One evening, he entered the kitchen unexpectedly and found her testing 3 different soup recipes. She offered him a spoon. "Tell me which one feels happiest." He blinked. "Happiest? People think chefs chase perfect flavors." She smiled. "I chase feelings." He sampled each bowl. The first tasted refined. The second was rich. The third reminded him of quiet Sundays from another lifetime. He pointed to the final bowl. "That one?" "I knew you would." She beamed. "I made it for people who finally believe tomorrow might be better." For several seconds, Alessandro forgot every meeting waiting upstairs. Forgot every criminal empire depending on his decisions. Forgot every wall he had spent years building around himself. When Grace looked at him, she never saw a billionaire, never saw a mafia boss. She simply saw a man who deserved dinner. That realization unsettled him more than any business rival ever could. Because for the first time in years, the possibility of losing someone felt infinitely more frightening than the possibility of trusting them. And as the acceptance deadline for the Grande Étoile drew closer, Alessandro Bellini began counting not the days remaining on her contract, but the dinners he might have left. The Bellini Foundation charity banquet was the social event of the season. International investors, diplomats, luxury hotel executives, fashion icons, television personalities. Everyone wanted an invitation. Grace wanted none of it. She spent the afternoon in the ballroom kitchen, sleeves rolled up, checking every sauce, tasting every garnish, and reminding her team that beautiful food meant nothing if it arrived cold. As always, she focused on the guests rather than the applause. Tonight's menu was her most ambitious creation yet. Comfort-inspired Italian classics, reimagined with elegant presentation. Handmade ravioli filled with slow braised short ribs. roasted sea bass over creamy saffron risotto, warm apple millefeuille paying quiet tribute to the dessert that had first earned Alessandro's trust. She never expected anyone outside the kitchen to know her name. Unfortunately, someone did. Bianca Romano arrived just before dinner, wearing a designer gown that drew cameras wherever she walked. A celebrated luxury lifestyle influencer, Bianca had become a familiar face at Bellini charity events. She was graceful, polished, and painfully aware of the attention she attracted. For months, she had tried to capture Alessandro's interest. For months, he had remained politely distant. Then she noticed something impossible. His attention often drifted toward the kitchen doors, toward Grace. Bianca followed his gaze. When she finally saw Grace directing the catering staff, disbelief flashed across her face. "That's the famous chef?" One guest nodded. "So I've heard." Bianca laughed softly. "I expected someone different." The comment spread through the nearby group. Grace continued organizing plates, unaware. But Bianca wasn't finished. As the first course was served, she deliberately walked toward the open kitchen entrance, ensuring several guests and photographers stood within earshot. She smiled sweetly. "So you're Grace?" Grace returned the smile. "Yes, welcome. I hope you enjoyed dinner." Bianca looked her up and down without hiding her judgment. "I must admit, I've always believed elegant cuisine reflects the chef." A few conversations nearby slowed. Bianca continued with a light laugh. "I suppose that's difficult when the chef looks like she loves the food a little too much." Silence. Several staff members lowered their eyes. One young server looked ready to protest. Grace simply inhaled slowly. Years of cruel comments had taught her that arguing rarely changed people. She picked up the next tray. "I hope you'll still enjoy the meal." Bianca tilted her head. "Oh, I'm sure I will. It's just surprising. World-class kitchens usually choose chefs who inspire discipline." "Oh, not dessert." A few uncomfortable laughs escaped from guests too afraid to challenge her. Grace felt the familiar sting she had carried since childhood. The school cafeteria, cooking competitions, job interviews where people assumed she lacked self-control before tasting a single dish. For one brief moment, she considered leaving the ballroom. Instead, she adjusted her apron, smiled at the next waiter, and calmly instructed, "Table 12 is ready for the second course." Service continued flawlessly. No shaking hands, no angry tears, only professionalism. What Grace didn't know was that Alessandro Bellini had heard every word. He had entered the ballroom moments earlier through a side entrance, accompanied by investors discussing an upcoming charitable initiative. The conversation ended the instant Bianca's final remark reached him. Lorenzo saw Alessandro stop walking. The room seemed to grow colder, not because anyone raised their voice, because the man who almost never displayed emotion suddenly became perfectly still. His gaze moved from Bianca to Grace. Grace was thanking a dishwasher for helping polish serving plates. She behaved as though nothing had happened, as though humiliation was simply another ingredient to be endured quietly. Something tightened inside Alessandro's chest. He had witnessed boardroom betrayals, corporate sabotage, violence, threats. None unsettled him like watching the woman who had quietly restored warmth to his home absorb cruelty without defending herself. For the first time that evening, he no longer cared about speeches, investors, or public appearances. He cared only about one thing: making sure everyone in that ballroom understood exactly who Grace Holloway was. And before the night ended, no one would ever dare laugh at her again. The ballroom remained unusually quiet. No one resumed their conversations. No one reached for another glass of wine. They were all waiting for Alessandro Bellini to continue walking toward the stage for his scheduled charity speech. Instead, he turned toward the kitchen. Every head followed him. Grace was carefully checking the final dessert plates, pretending she had not noticed the uncomfortable silence surrounding Bianca's remarks. She had spent too many years learning how to keep working while pretending cruel words did not hurt. Then she heard her name. Grace. She looked up. Alessandro stood only a few feet away. His expression was calm. Too calm. Would you join me for a moment? Confused, Grace wiped her hands on her apron. If dinner needs adjusting, I can... It doesn't. His voice was quiet, but unmistakably firm. It is exactly as it should be. Without another explanation, he offered his arm. Grace hesitated before walking beside him into the center of the ballroom. Hundreds of guests watched. Camera flashes illuminated the room. Bianca's confident smile slowly faded. Alessandro accepted the microphone, prepared for his charity address. He glanced once at the audience before speaking. Tonight, many of you have complimented the dinner. Soft applause followed. He continued. You praised the balance of every course. The elegance, the restraint, the warmth. His eyes shifted toward Grace. None of it was my achievement. He paused. Every dish served this evening was created by Grace Holloway. The ballroom erupted into surprised murmurs. Grace stared at him in disbelief. Until that moment, most guests had assumed Bellini Manor had hired an anonymous catering company or an internationally famous consulting chef. Instead, the woman standing beside Alessandro was the chef responsible for every bite they had enjoyed. One investor rose from his seat. The saffron risotto was extraordinary. Another guest nodded enthusiastically. The apple dessert reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen. A renowned hotel owner smiled. I haven't experienced food with that much heart in years. Soon the compliments came from every direction. Several international investors crossed the ballroom to congratulate Grace personally. One requested permission to feature her seasonal recipes at an upcoming culinary summit. Another asked whether she accepted consulting projects overseas. Grace struggled to answer. She had spent years believing people noticed only her appearance. Now, they were speaking only about her food. Across the room, Bianca stood frozen. The same guests who had laughed politely at her remarks only minutes earlier were now surrounding Grace with admiration. Someone quietly asked Bianca whether she had tasted the apple millefeuille. She offered no reply. Embarrassment colored her face. Realizing there was nothing left to salvage, she quietly collected her evening clutch and walked toward the exit. No dramatic confrontation followed, no public argument. Her own words had already become her humiliation. Alessandro never looked in her direction. She was no longer important. Grace was. Later that evening, after the final guests departed and the staff began clearing the ballroom, Grace returned to the kitchen, exhausted, but smiling. She was carefully wrapping leftover bread for the night security team when Lorenzo approached. The boss would like to see you. She found Alessandro waiting alone inside the private library. The room felt strangely informal. No executives, no bodyguards, only 2 cups of tea resting on a low table. Grace smiled nervously. If this is about the banquet, thank you. You deserved every word. I've never had anyone stand up for me like that. You should have. Silence settled between them. Finally, Alessandro reached inside a leather folder and placed a single document on the table. It was not a contract. It contained only one number. $1,000. Grace blinked. I don't understand. I'll transfer it immediately. She looked back at him. For what? So you'll stay. She frowned. The Grande Étoile. I know about their offer. I'll match anything they pay. No. I'll exceed it. His voice remained controlled, but beneath the composure was unmistakable urgency. I'll give you $1 million. You only have to decline their offer. Grace stared at the paper for a long time. The warmth she had carried all evening slowly disappeared. So, she whispered, you want me to give up my dream? No. Then why are you asking me to stay? He searched for words that had never come easily. Nothing followed. The silence lasted too long. Grace's eyes lowered to the document once more. Years of being underestimated flooded back all at once. People who believed money could solve everything. Employers who expected loyalty to be purchased. People who admired her work, but never truly saw her. A sad smile touched her lips. I understand now. Alessandro looked up immediately. No, Grace. She folded the paper and placed it gently back on the table. You think I'm easier to replace with money than with honesty. His heartbeat seemed to stop, because that was the exact opposite of the truth. But before he could find the courage to explain, Grace quietly removed her apron, placed it beside the untouched offer, and walked out of the library without looking back. For the first time since she had entered Bellini Manor, dinner would be served the next evening, without the person who had taught the house how to feel like a home. Grace's resignation reached Bellini Manor before sunrise. There were no dramatic speeches, no accusations, only a handwritten envelope resting on Lorenzo's desk. Inside was a short note. Thank you for trusting my cooking. I'll always be grateful for the home your staff gave me. Please tell Mr. Bellini I wish him good health. And please remind him, breakfast still matters. Grace Lorenzo read it twice before quietly placing it on Alessandro's desk. When Alessandro arrived, he immediately noticed the familiar handwriting. He finished reading without changing his expression. Only after several long seconds did he ask, Has she already left? An hour ago. Did she say anything else? Lorenzo hesitated. No. That single word echoed through the enormous office long after the conversation ended. The mansion changed almost overnight. Breakfast returned untouched. Fresh bread no longer filled the hallways. The kitchen remained perfectly organized, yet strangely silent. Professional chefs prepared flawless meals. Alessandro barely tasted them. One evening, Mrs. Brooks gently replaced an untouched bowl of soup with another recipe. It was Grace's. He lifted the spoon. One bite. Then he quietly placed it back down. It isn't hers. No. Mrs. Brooks smiled sadly. Because recipes were never what you missed. After she left, Alessandro remained alone in the dining room for the first time in years. The silence felt unbearable. Meanwhile, Grace accepted the position at the Grand Étoile. The hotel's announcement spread quickly through international culinary media, interviews, magazine covers, television appearances. Everyone celebrated the inspiring story of an overlooked chef finally receiving the recognition she deserved. Everyone except Grace. She loved the kitchen. She loved creating new menus. She loved mentoring young cooks. Yet every evening, just before service began, she instinctively prepared one extra bowl of soup. Only after setting it aside did she remember there was no one waiting for dinner anymore. One weekend Noah visited after closing his restaurant. You should be happier. Grace forced a smile. I am. No. He poured them both tea. You're successful. But you're lonely. She looked away. I made the right decision. I know. Then why doesn't it feel like winning? Noah considered his words carefully. Because sometimes Choosing your dream still costs you someone. Grace whispered. He offered me money to stay. He did. So that means I mattered only as an employee. Noah frowned. Did he actually say that? She opened her mouth, then stopped. No. He never had. At Bellini Manor, Lorenzo finally decided to speak honestly. He entered Alessandro's office carrying the $1 million proposal still resting inside its untouched folder. You should throw this away. Alessandro looked up. I intended to protect her. You frightened her. Silence. Lorenzo continued. You negotiate every problem in your life. Companies, governments, criminal alliances. You've spent decades believing everything has a price. His voice softened. But Grace was never asking for money. Alessandro lowered his eyes toward the unsigned document. What was she asking for? Lorenzo answered without hesitation. To know why she mattered. Those words struck harder than any threat Alessandro had ever faced. His thoughts drifted backward through the past months. Grace reminding him to eat breakfast, fresh bread waiting after long flights, homemade soup on difficult evenings, the way she smiled at every employee, from executives to gardeners, as though every person deserved kindness. She had never tried to impress him. She had simply cared, and he had responded with a financial offer, not because he doubted her value, because fear had spoken before honesty. For the first time in years, Alessandro admitted something to himself he had refused to name. He wasn't afraid of losing an extraordinary chef. He was afraid of losing the woman who had quietly become the safest part of his life. The woman who had transformed a mansion into a home. 2 days later, Alessandro arrived at the Grand Étoile without security escorts or corporate advisors. He waited outside the employee entrance until Grace finished the evening service. She looked genuinely surprised to see him. I thought billionaires made appointments. I tried. You never answered. She folded her arms, though there was no anger in her expression anymore. Only caution. He drew a slow breath. I owe you the truth. She remained silent. I never offered that money because I wanted to own your future. I offered it because I panicked. Grace blinked. He continued before courage disappeared. The day I heard you might leave, I realized I couldn't imagine that house without you. You didn't just cook meals. You made people laugh. You remembered birthdays. You convinced hardened bodyguards to eat homemade cookies. A faint smile appeared despite herself. You even made me eat breakfast. His own smile was small but genuine. I thought if I could solve the problem quickly, I wouldn't have to admit what I was really afraid of. Her voice was barely above a whisper. And what was that? Alessandro met her eyes. I wasn't afraid of losing my chef. He paused. I was terrified of losing the woman who had become my home. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Not because of the confession alone, but because, for the first time in her life, someone had chosen her. Not despite her dreams. Not because of her cooking. Simply because her presence had changed his world. Neither of them reached for the other's hand. Not yet. Some moments deserved patience, and this one had been slowly preparing itself from the very first bowl of soup. 6 months later, a quiet corner of downtown welcomed its newest restaurant. The sign above the entrance read simply, Grace's Table. There were no crystal chandeliers, no gold-plated decorations, no celebrity photographs covering the walls, only an open kitchen, fresh flowers picked from local gardens, warm wooden tables, and the comforting aroma of bread baking every morning before sunrise. Grace had built the restaurant exactly the way she believed food should be. Honest, comforting, personal. Reservations filled months in advance. Not because diners expected extravagant luxury, they came hoping to experience something increasingly rare. A meal that made them feel understood. Food critics praised her refined techniques. Families returned because every dish reminded them of home. Young chefs applied from around the world, hoping to learn not only recipes, but also the quiet philosophy behind them. Grace always gave them the same advice. People forget ingredients. They never forget how you made them feel. On the restaurant's official opening day, television crews gathered outside long before sunrise. One reporter suddenly pointed toward the end of the line. A black luxury sedan had stopped across the street. Alessandro Bellini stepped onto the sidewalk, impeccably dressed, as always. The billionaire CEO. The man whispered about in boardrooms and feared in darker circles. Instead of entering through the private entrance offered by the staff, he quietly joined the end of the public line. The cameras immediately surrounded him. "Mr. Bellini," a reporter hurried closer. "You own restaurants that would gladly reserve every table for you. Why are you waiting like everyone else?" Another added. "Surely the owner would welcome you immediately." Alessandro glanced toward the restaurant window, where Grace was laughing with her kitchen team while arranging fresh loaves of bread. A gentle smile appeared on his face, one the world had rarely seen before. He answered calmly, "Because the best things in my life were never meant to be reserved." The reporters fell silent. Inside the restaurant, Grace happened to look through the front window. She recognized him instantly. Their eyes met across the crowded sidewalk. This time, she did not see the feared Mafia Boss. She saw the man who had finally learned that love could never be negotiated. She untied her apron, walked to the front door, and opened it herself. The waiting customers smiled, expecting her to invite Alessandro inside immediately. Instead, she laughed softly. "You've been following the rules lately." "I've had an excellent teacher." She pretended to consider his answer. "And did you eat breakfast?" "I did." "And only 3 cups of coffee?" He nodded obediently. "Exactly 3. The customers around them chuckled. Grace stepped aside and finally held the door open. "Then I suppose you've earned a table." Alessandro shook his head with a smile. "I'd rather earn the chance to keep coming back." A faint blush warmed Grace's cheeks. "That," she said, "depends on whether you're willing to wait in line every time." "I will. Even if the line reaches the next block. I'll still wait." She looked at him for a long moment before offering the answer he had once hoped for, but never dared expect. "Then come in. Not as my employer. Not as the man everyone fears." She smiled the same quiet smile that had first transformed a silent mansion into a home. "But as the man I'm finally ready to welcome into my heart." As the restaurant door closed behind them, the line outside continued to grow. Not because people had witnessed a billionaire, but because they had just seen something far rarer. 2 people who discovered that the richest life is built one shared meal and one honest heart at a time.